Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
Welcome to another edition of the Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, a lot to discuss this week, and let's try and disentangle the various parts, but start with a kind of self-contained question. The government's policy still is not to rule out no deal. You have senior ministers, cabinet ministers in fact, campaigning openly for the ruling out of no deal and saying pretty much in terms that they will vote for the Cooper-Letwin amendment this week, which could well lead to the ruling out of no deal. Should they be fired?
Well, first of all, the Cooper-Bowles, Cooper-Letwin bill doesn't really rule out no deal.
I said it could lead to the ruling out of no deal, and that plainly is the intent.
That's the intent is to keep us in the European Union. It's not that they want a deal in 3 months' time. It's that they don't want to leave the European Union. They've always been Remainers. They remain Remainers. It's about frustrating Brexit. And the bill itself only works if the government cooperates with it, because it would require the government to put forward a sensible proposal for extension, not just any old proposal, and then crucially bringing forward the statutory instrument that would lead to the extension, which the bill does not try to compel. So any strong government could deal with Cooper-Bowles very straightforwardly. Should they resign or be sacked? I think the breakdown of collective responsibility is something that's been going on over this issue particularly for some time. The Prime Minister, after Chequers, said that from now on collective responsibility was reasserted, and that simply hasn't happened, though it seems to have not happened more in the pro-Remain direction than in the Leave direction. There is a limit, and that limit must be voting against the government on a three-line whip that, as you wrote, fairly enough, backbenchers are allowed to do this. Cabinet ministers, PPSs are not, and by the act of voting against, they would have resigned. It's not a question of do they then get fired or do they have to resign beforehand. If you do not support the government, you are no longer a member of that government, and that is the basic constitutional position. To fail to resign before voting against the government would, in an old-fashioned way, be very bad manners, would not be a proper way for a politician to behave. And as I happen to think that Greg Clark, Amber Rudd and David Gauke are three very polite people, I would be surprised if they voted against, but if they did vote against, I'm sure they would have the courtesy to ask the Prime Minister to tender their resignations to the Sovereign.
But if they didn't, she'd have to remove them, yes.
They go. I mean, voting against the government means you resign from the government, full stop.
OK, we've dealt with that. Let's move on to the next aspect of what we need to explore this morning, which is the whole question of extension. Now, we've just had a brief go at how the Cooper-Letwin bill introduced by means of this amendment could lead to no Brexit, and that's evidently the intention of some of the people who support it. Some of the others seem to want a soft Brexit, softer than the Prime Minister's deal, and there you are.
Well, I think the ones who think it will lead to a soft Brexit are being carried along by those who are trying to stop Brexit. That I don't think that is a sensible view to take. A delay is about stopping Brexit, and anyone who thinks otherwise is gullible.
Well, that's certainly a view, and I think it's true that if you got into extension, there would then be a debate about what happens next, and the supporters of Norway Plus would be pitted against the supporters of a second referendum. And we've seen them both have a go at each other this year and earlier.
Damien Hines put it very well this morning, and Damien, to declare an interest, is a very old friend of mine and has never been a Eurosceptic. Damien and I have discussed this issue going back to university days and have never particularly agreed on it. But what he said about extension was characteristically wise and moderately stated. And that is, it doesn't change anything. That you're just extending a period of discussing things where you have no idea of where you're going. So what do you achieve by an extension? And I thought, from somebody who is a principled pro-European, that was a very moderating comment.
Do you believe Theresa May is now intent on extension?
I don't think so. It's very hard to read what the Prime Minister is intent on and has been all the way along. What I think is still happening is that two sides are being shown two different outcomes. So for the Leavers, the position is that if you don't back my deal, we'll extend. And to the Remainers, it is still that if you don't back my deal, we'll leave without a deal. And the problem is that as these two are contradictory, if the wires get crossed, the Remainers think, oh good, if we don't vote for her deal, we'll have an extension. And the Leavers think, oh good, we'll leave without a deal. So I don't think the Prime Minister's intent is clear, and that I don't think the confusion of intent is actually helping the Prime Minister's position.
Let me take you through the logic of believing that she may well now be going for an extension. Daily Telegraph this morning published a story that said Downing Street was looking at the options, and I can give you three reasons why it might be. The first is that Downing Street will be terrified it's going to have this forced on them anyway by Cooper, Letwin, Cooper, and it might as well take control of the process. Second, it's worried that it will have it forced on the government by Rudd, Gawke, Clark and other ministers voting with Cooper, Letwin, and it wants to head that off because it believes it will face this question afterwards of whether or not it has to fire them, the one we've just discussed. Third, the government's running out of time in any event to get a vote in favour of its deal and then get a bill through by March the 29th. So there are three quite powerful reasons for thinking the Prime Minister might now be going for extension.
Well, of those three, the first is only effective if the government goes along with it. I've read the bill quite carefully, and the bill cannot force an extension. It can create political pressure for one, but it can't force one. On the Clark, Rudd, Gawke question, very interesting. I had a very jolly evening on Friday, playing Call My Bluff with Greg Clark in his constituency. And then I spoke to his association, and as it was his association, I spoke about what Conservatives agree on rather than on Europe, and discovered that there is a lot that we agree on, and the party is more united than we might think. But Call My Bluff seems to me to be an appropriate game to have been playing. I think the Prime Minister can call that bluff. It is noticeable that on the Eurosceptic side, people who have had principled opposition to the track the government's going down have resigned and said, up with this I will not put, and have moved on to the back benches. And I think their opposition, therefore, is a more serious degree than people who just say, well, we don't like this very much, and we might do something about it one day. Let's them put their money where their mouth is. That's, I think, a reasonable position for Downing Street to take on that. And the third point, we're running out of time. Well, we've always been running out of time. Tick-tock goes the clock, and that is a reflection of the negotiations, and indeed partly a reflection of the negotiating strategy. That's not news to the Prime Minister.
You're not saying the scenario I've sketched out may not be true, you're simply saying it's problematic.
I'm saying it's problematic, and it's a matter of choice. This is the key, and this is the unknown bit. Of course you'd expect the Prime Minister's box to be filled with options. The Prime Minister has to consider the options. But ultimately, the Prime Minister must choose. One of the propositions that has been thrown up recently is that the ERG are making Brexit less likely, and it's all the fault of the dastardly ERG. Everyone knows this is nonsense. that governments make decisions, not groups of backbenchers, and that governments are responsible for whether their policies work or not. If the Prime Minister does not deliver Brexit, the Prime Minister will be held responsible for not delivering Brexit. Whatever clever scenario is worked up to try and hide behind, it will be her choice.
Just on this subject of the ERG, there is a view around about Cooper-Letwin, Letwin-Cooper, which is as follows. It passing would be jolly useful for the Prime Minister, because she can then go to the ERG and say, you've got to help me out, folks, because if we do not pass whatever revised deal I put to you on, I think, March the 12th, Cooper-Letwin will kick in on March the 13th, and the whole business will be out of my hands. It'll be in the hands of the Commons and will be on the road roll to no Brexit. You'd better vote for my deal, you know. What do you say to that?
I'd say the only person who would believe that is somebody who has no understanding of the British Constitution. The Constitution doesn't work like that. The Cooper-Bowles or Cooper-Letwin bill is absolutely the edges of constitutional propriety, because it sets out in statute motions that must be laid before the House of Commons. But this is simply not a justiciable matter, because the courts are not allowed to consider the proceedings in Parliament under Article 9 of the Bill of Rights. So it's a matter that ought to be the standing orders of the House of Commons and judged in the House of Commons that is being made into legislation. So it's constitutionally a bad bill. But because it's constitutionally a bad bill, the implementation of it is basically at the discretion of the government. So the Prime Minister, if she were to come along and say, look, it's out of my hands, would be saying something that was not factually accurate. Now, I wouldn't say that there would be any sense of impropriety in saying it, because people don't always follow the intricacies of the Constitution carefully. But the position would remain that the executive would have to implement this policy and would have to take steps that made the bill effective beyond the black letter of the law. If the government were merely to stick to the black letter of the law, no extension need occur.
You're basically, for the second time in a week, at least, playing call my bluff, aren't you? You're saying if the Prime Minister or the whips said this to you, you would say in plain terms, sorry, it doesn't work that way. If the Commons votes for an extension, we will carry on fighting for what the Conservative manifesto said.
That is correct. That, you see, there are stages in Cooper-Letwin. It's fascinating Nick Bowles has gone off the headline of this. I don't know if there's any particular reason for that, and Oliver Letwin has taken it on, but you may know more than I do about why it's changed. The stage that the bill would produce is a motion in Parliament requiring the Prime Minister or a Minister to ask for an extension. As I said at the beginning of this conversation, it can't and doesn't set out the conditions of extension that would be asked for, the purpose of the extension. So that raises questions as to whether the EU would want to go along with it anyway. But say the EU did go along with it and said, OK, you can have an extension. That then requires a statutory instrument to be brought before the House of Commons, and statutory instruments can only be moved by the government. The government would simply not need to move that statutory instrument, and there is no method of forcing it, particularly in the time available.
Essentially, you would say to the whips or Downing Street or whoever, look, if the Letwin provisions come into effect, they don't take no deal off the table anyway. They simply provide for an extension. Next, the EU might not provide one. Third, you don't have to go along with all this anyway. So we're calling your bluff, and we're not going to vote for your deal if we're still dissatisfied with it.
That is right, yes.
Though the ERG being quite a large body of people, about 80, it's possible that this bluff may stampede some members of it into the government lobby.
That's, of course, an issue, that how many people will in the end go one way and how many will go another. There is a much simpler option for the government, that is that it were to adopt the Malthouse Compromise either immediately or by a strict and short deadline for the backstop.
And remove the entire backstop from the withdrawal agreement.
Well, I would be in favour of that, but if you assume that that's not going to happen, you could say that the backstop will have a time limit of, say, October or November, and that by then the government will have managed to sort out the negotiations on Malthouse.
Would that be acceptable to you, a change in the text of the withdrawal agreement, so there was a unilateral right to leave the backstop or a date by which the backstop would end?
Well, if the backstop becomes de facto impossible, then yes. If it were a date in 2027, then no.
See, there's a spectrum of possibilities here, aren't there? They range from an alteration to the date of the backstop, taking us out of it perhaps before the next election, or an insertion of a very clear unilateral right to leave.
No, unilateral right to leave won't be good enough. Look at the numbers in the House of Commons and the overwhelming desire of the House of Commons not to leave at all. And that would simply not be delivering on the referendum result, because
you need a date.
A date is the minimum. Ideally, it would be removed altogether and replaced with Malthouse Compromise.
I try to explore this because there is a spectrum which go all the way from the attorney changing his mind for no apparent reason, all the way through codicils and interpretive instruments, no change in that case to the text of the backstop, all the way through to the far end of the spectrum, which is the insertion of the date.
Trevor Kavanagh had a very sensible idea in his column in The Sun on Monday morning, which is that you have an appendix, because an appendix is part of the text but hasn't reopened the text, and therefore you might allow people to save face, because they'd be able to say, well, the text hasn't been reopened, it has been added to, and that is different. And bear in mind that the backstop is in fact an appendix anyway, so you would simply be adding another appendix. It would have the same legal standing. I think that would be an answer to the problems around reopening the text.
Just to be clear, there is a differentiation of view within the ERG about all this, isn't there? Because some people would echo what you've just said about a date for the backstop, taking us out before the next election. Other people say, when I talk to them who are members of the ERG, no, it's not good enough, we're against the whole thing entire, we don't believe in giving up the 39 billion at this particular stage, we're worried about other sections of the agreement, and we are going to vote against it, come hell or high water.
The date may well not be sufficient in itself. It would so much depend on the noises around it that the date becomes interesting if it is tied in with text indicating that Malthouse will be the replacement for the backstop, and that will be agreed in short rather than long order, just a random date. Butters no parsnips, because such a date could be extended and nobody would really believe it would happen.
But even then, some of your colleagues would say, yeah, but we shouldn't be giving up 39 billion at this stage for anything, even a pretty solid assurance that Malthouse will occupy the substance of the trade negotiation.
I have pointed out in these conversations before that I'm not the most hardline member of the ERG, and that the ERG is a group of people with varying views, but who are committed to us leaving the European Union.
Would you welcome back Anna Soubry, Heidi Allen and Sarah Wollaston?
There's more joy in heaven over the one sinner who repenteth than the 99 who are not in need of repentance.
Of course, they would need to repent. You can't just have them back.
Well, they would have to support the manifesto on which they were elected. And I think this is important.
Were you sorry when they went?
Oh, yes, of course I'm sorry. I'm always sorry when people leave the Conservative Party. And I think that the Conservative Party needs to be a broad church. That it is a shame that there is no longer, in Anna Soubry's view, room in the party both for her and for me. I think that is a pity. And I think it is all about Brexit, that Ms Soubry was very clear that she backed George Osborne's austerity, the economic policies that I back too, and which have been very successful for this country. And Brexit in the end is a means to an end rather than something of itself. So it leads to greater flexibility in the policies we can implement in future, and in my view to better government. But it's not what conservatism is exclusively about by any means.
Do you think this group, which I'm assuming is going to become a party, is going to become a centre party or a centre-left party?
Well, it's clearly a centre-left party. That's where its roots are, that the first people to join it are from the Labour Party. It's a new Labour light, isn't it, rather than a centre party.
In the event of no deal, is it possible to imagine a number of soft Brexity or Remainy Conservative MPs joining it, just as in the event of no Brexit? Isn't it possible to imagine a revived Nigel Farage-style Purple Party?
In the event of no deal on the 29th of March, then it's hard to see what possible purpose the independent group serves, because the one thing it's been set up to do is to stop Brexit, and Brexit would have happened. It's all about Brexit, TIG.
Not for the Labour members, surely.
The Labour members have gone for other reasons, but their party wouldn't have so much focus. So I'd be surprised if people flocked to something whose raison d'etre had been removed. It would be going backwards.
Just to pursue this, isn't the raison d'etre for the Labour people quite different? I mean, they mentioned Brexit in their statement in passing, because the key is that for Anna and for Sarah and for Heidi, Brexit was obviously a preoccupation. You spoke at Greg Clark's meeting about all the other things the Conservatives have in common. The difference with Labour at the moment is they feel it's more than just Brexit, as far as they're concerned, at issue between them and Jeremy Corbyn. They think he's taking the party in the wrong direction on a number of on almost every other party, and has made Labour institutionally anti-Semitic. So it's a different kind of problem, and a problem of a different order.
The Labour Party has massive problems, but it's fascinating that Frank Field and Ian Austin have not joined this new group, because this new group is all about Brexit. So what you say is absolutely true, but it doesn't contradict what I was saying about it being a fundamentally Brexit party. It's the mirror image of Nigel Farage, actually. It's the non-KIP party.
But in the event of no deal, these people, the Leslies and Chukas and Luciana Burgess, they'd keep going because their objections to Corbyn would still be there, Brexit or not.
That's right, and they may have more of an appeal once Brexit is settled one way or another, because then they might be able to broaden out and attract the Ian Austins and the Frank Fields of this world, who would be perhaps interested in a party that wasn't anti-Semitic and had soft left views, but not one that is basically there to frustrate Brexit, which they believe in delivering for their voters. So it becomes, post-Brexit, it becomes much more interesting in terms of what's happening on the left. And from the point of view of the right, we suddenly start concentrating on what we agree on again, because truth be told, without Brexit, there is remarkably little division in the Tory party. The matters of nuance rather than of fundamental principle.
We must get back to talking about that another time. I did want to ask you one final question before we close. This weekend, the National Convention, which is described on the Conservative Party's own website as the Parliament of the Conservative Party, passed by 75 votes to 15, a motion that's highly relevant to the discussion we were having earlier about no Brexit. The motion might or might not, from your point of view, be perfect, but it did state pretty clearly no second referendum and the government will or should deliver Brexit. What do you think about the fact that the National Convention, which is not a rebellious body, it's not some random gathering of activists, passed this motion this weekend?
It's important and reassuring that the Conservative Party in the country, and I probably address as many Conservative associations as any other Member of Parliament, is surprisingly unideological. I'm speaking in Greg Clark's constituency, once again, one of the first people I meet in the village, the person who runs the local church's activities and the treasurer of the local church, that there are people in their community who do good work because they believe it's a good thing to do, and part of that is being a member of a political party and promoting our democratic system. It's not and never has been a hardline ideological group. And so for this group, of its most senior members, to say this is what we're expecting is something that MPs and the Cabinet should take notice of. It's highly unusual, as you say. It is the most loyal group of people, most supportive in all circumstances of the leadership. And it shows who is in tune with whom. That is to say, the Eurosceptics in the House of Commons, call them the ERG for want of a better term, and the Conservative benches, are in tune with the Conservative Party at large and with Conservative voters. There's been this line that we represent very few people and so on. This just isn't true. We represent the people who put us in office and who want the Conservative Party manifesto implemented. And of course, Theresa May's own manifesto, written by her and her team in secret, nobody else knew about it, said we would leave the single market, we would leave the customs union, we would leave the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, and no deal is better than a bad deal. The party is at one, minus a few who never accepted the referendum result in the first place.
Talking of bringing that view to the attention of Theresa May, Downing Street ministers and Conservative MPs, wouldn't it be a good thing, as Conservative Home suggested this morning, if, since we're in the AGM season, local associations passed the same motion?
Almost every idea the Conservative Home has is an idea of inspired genius, and this is at the higher end of this inspirational genius. I think that would be a very good thing to do, and dare I say much preferable than trying to tack individual members of the parliamentary party. That the party needs to be a broad church in Parliament, and although it's quite right that local associations determine who their flag carrier is, trying to have purges on the grounds of ideological purity would be fundamentally unconservative in my view. And so to have a statement of what they believe as an association, I think would be very powerful and much better than having a witch hunt against individual members.
Jacob, thank you very much.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.